Now Thomas Hearns is an open book to Ray Leonard. Backs up against the ropes.
This is one of the most unusual calls by a referee in the history of the sport.
The first loss. A tremendous victory. Leonard fighting off the ropes.
It happened. It happened. Uppercut by Douglas. Down goes Tyson.
Thompson, right hand shot.
Excellent. Knocks out by Tyson.
Slumps to the canvas.
The champion struggles to stay on his feet.
How do you like it? How do you like it?
Welcome again, fight fans, to another episode of Legendary Nights with me, your host Sean Bastow, shortly to be joined, as always, by Johnston Brown for this additional episode to the Legendary Nights feed, and it's celebrating St. Valentine's Day, and what better way to do it by breaking down the sixth and final fight between Sugar Ray Robinson and Jake LaMotta, aptly dubbed the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Before we get into this episode, of course, go and check us out on social media at Legend Night Pod on Twitter and BTR Boxing Podcast Facebook page. If you've not already subscribed to the podcast, you can do so by checking us out on Apple Podcasts or Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify, Castbox, TuneIn, any of the available podcasting apps out there. You can search Legendary Nights and you will find all the latest episode and the catalogue of previous episodes out there. So, this is the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This is Sugar Ray Robinson versus Jake LaMotta, number 6. What a way to spend your St. Valentine's Day by listening to this episode, the tale of Sugar Ray Robinson versus Jake LaMotta, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. I'm really excited to do this one, Johnson. This is one that we decided we were going to put in there last minute because it's St. Valentine's Day. It's what's been commercialised as you need to go out there and you need to go and buy your wife a box of chocolates and all the rest of it. But this Legendary Night is the real St. Valentine's Day. This is what we want to talk about. Now, obviously, for anybody that doesn't know what the St. Valentine's Day Massacre is, of course, it was an incident which involved basically a gang-style execution, which happened, I think it was the late 20s, early 30s it happened, but this fight in particular was labelled the St. Valentine's Day Massacre because of how brutal it was, and we're going to get into this tale. So, Johnston, what a fight, great pick, really excited to do this, and what a way to spend Valentine's Day.
Yeah, I couldn't think of anything better than maybe sit down with the missus, your wife, whatever it is, get the candles lit and stick this on black and white on ESPN, YouTube. Oh, she loves you, mate. And all a bit of blood and guts, but one thing you don't see black and white, you don't really see the blood, unfortunately. We have to look at or read certain articles. You can see that, I'm not going to give too much away, but a certain fight against his face absolutely mangled. But mainly you probably work it out from the film Raging Bull. Maybe stick that on Valentine's Day. That's another good film to watch on Valentine's Day. But yeah, I think it's a no-brainer. Legendary Nights, we had a little gap. Valentine's Day coming up. If it's in Valentine's Day Massacre it's a great tale and one that I'm looking forward to telling.
So, as always, we'll cover the Legendary Nights episode in the format that we do, which is to cover the careers of both men in the lead up to this particular fight. Bearing in mind they fought 5 times prior to this 6th and final fight. We'll be touching on some significant fights in the lead up to this fight. We'll talk a little bit about the build up, which is always difficult to find out about because of how long ago this fight happened. There's not a lot of footage around there to find. There's only quotes and articles that you can get information from, and we did manage to find a few little nibblies in there to get onto. So we're going to talk about the build up to the fight, and then of course the fight itself. An amazing night, really, and an infamous night in so many different ways. So of course, let's talk about the career of both of these men, because both of these men are legendary fighters in their own right. And starting for me first, we'll start with the Raging Bull, Mr. Jake LaMotta. Let's start by talking a little bit about Jake and his career in the lead up to this 6th and final fight. So for Jake LaMotta then, everybody knows him as this fantastic fighter, as he was, and most of the younger generation, people from our era probably only know Jake LaMotta through watching the Robert De Niro film, The Raging Bull, from 1980. But this particular career that he had was unbelievable, really, when you look back on it. And we're going to touch on a couple of them fights in the lead up to the fight with Sugar Ray Robinson, the 6th and final fight. So his actual career, Jake LaMotta, started in 1941. It actually started during the Second World War, and he wasn't your average fighter. He would go on and he would win fights and he would lose fights throughout the course of his career. And when he got to the first fight with Sugar Ray Robinson, which was only a year later after he turned professional, by the way, 1942, October the 2nd, he was 25, 5-2, and Sugar Ray Robinson was 35-0 at this point. And it happened in Madison Square Gardens. It was a big fight. It was a massive fight at that time because these two were very popular guys at this particular point. And what was interesting about it was that Jake LaMotta was, for the majority of his career, was actually just a full-blown solid middleweight. And he always had the weight advantage over Sugar Ray Robinson. Sugar Ray Robinson is by far the best welterweight that has ever graced the squared circle. Ray Robinson, yet again, as you'll find throughout most of his career when you look back on the history, he moved up a weight because the competition wasn't good enough in his own weight.
It's crazy, isn't it? He was a welterweight, and he wasn't a champion at the time, obviously. It's crazy to think, but 35-0 wasn't even getting a look in, and Jake LaMotta is, he's had his losses. He's in a situation where he's also a bit feared as well. So he's a feared middleweight. Not many people really want to fight Jake, or Jack. Some people call him Jake, however you want to pronounce it. I mean, I'd say Jake LaMotta has always been Jake LaMotta to me, and Sugar Ray as well, but both two different weights. And actually, in his first fight, he was actually 10 pounds heavier, Jake LaMotta, than Sugar Ray Robinson. But it didn't matter one iota because Sugar Ray was quite simply, he was brilliant that night as well. His hands were, he was just too quick with his hands. His footwork was excellent, as you'd always see with Sugar Ray Robinson. He had this fantastic style, and when you watch him, if you ever get the footage, sort of in these sort of days, the one fight you'll get to see on video or on footage online will tend to be the 6th one, because the footage of these fights just are not around. So we have to just take what the guys at ringside have written about it, and by the sounds of it, is Sugar was just too quick, and he took 7 of the 10 rounds, and it was a pretty one-sided fight. And considering that Sugar Ray was a welterweight and he's fighting a middleweight, and you're talking about Jake LaMotta, who was very solid. He could take a shot. I mean, he probably got one of the most granite chins in boxing history. I suppose Marvin Hagler is the only other person I can think of that had a chin like him. But the first fight was pretty much all Sugar Ray. Considering he was a welterweight, it's pretty marvellous, really. He moved on, LaMotta, and he got a few more wins under his belt before fighting Sugar Ray for a second time.
Yeah, it was weird, wasn't it? Because the competition is so sparse at that point in time that Sugar Ray Robinson is having to face Jake LaMotta yet again only 4 months later on February the 5th, 1943. Now, this fight was a little bit different from the first fight because out of the 6 fights, this was the only one that Jake LaMotta actually picked up the victory on. So, February the 5th, 1943, Sugar Ray Robinson's 40-0, Jake LaMotta 31-5-2. And the fight was different this time round because Jake LaMotta, he fought with a lot more tenacity in this fight, and he was cutting off the ring a lot more, and with no pun intended, he was bullying his way on the inside, pounding right hands to the body and left hooks upstairs. And it was in the 8th round that Jake LaMotta put Sugar Ray Robinson down for the first time in his career, sending Sugar Ray Robinson through the ropes. And you might have seen that picture on social media or on the internet or in articles, but it's quite a famous picture because it's the only time really you see Sugar Ray Robinson in his career in real trouble like that, and someone managed to get a really good clear picture of it, which is great and historic. So LaMotta took Sugar Ray Robinson all the way. You would have think, looking at that picture, that fight would have been over there when he knocked him through the ropes, but Sugar Ray Robinson, absolute legend that he was, got back up and carried on the fight, and it went the full distance of 10 rounds, and Jake LaMotta picks up the unanimous decision victory over him. So they've got 1 win for Sugar Ray Robinson, 1 win for Jake LaMotta. And again, going back to what I said at the start there about the competition being so sparse within the welterweight and middleweight divisions at the time, that it was only 3 weeks later they ended up fighting again.
Ray, when you get about ready to do a fight, how many hours of training a day do you do?
Well, it's the whole day goes to training.
In other words, from the time you get up in the morning, there's no canasta or gin rummy or bridge in the afternoon or anything like that?
Oh, yes. That's all helps your mental attitude. You have things of that sort, but you can't break training. No eating ice cream or doing anything like that you shouldn't be doing.
What happens to that mental attitude, Ray, when you get in the ring?
Well,
Every man for himself, then.
That's right.
Although I've heard that the best fighter and the best boxer in the world is the guy who has a calm quality about him.
Well, that's true, too, because once you get away from that, you lose all sense of skill.
And it's such a crazy thing because obviously this fight, 3 weeks later, and they decide to fight again. I mean, Sugar Ray Robinson, I did read something where apparently he felt, or his team felt, that he was a little bit overweight for the second one, so he did take a little fight in between, and then he decided to take the rematch, as I say, 3 weeks later. I think he fought literally a week before as well, so he was obviously trying to get himself in shape, realising that he needs to adjust. And one thing you all know when you go through Sugar Ray's career is he adjusts so well, and it's just devastating in a rematch if he ever loses. And obviously that's his first defeat, 40-0. So 41 was 40-1 going into the LaMotta fight. And LaMotta obviously finally feels like he's got his number. He's managed to cut the ring off. He knows exactly what he's going to bring. And Sugar Ray switches it up once again. And although, once again, LaMotta does put Robertson down in the 7th for an 8 count, it was another impressive performance from Sugar Ray Robertson, who basically just showed how much of a true class welterweight he was, and just a class boxer he was in general. And he outclassed LaMotta, unfortunately, on that night in Michigan, in Detroit. And he managed to go 41-1, and he didn't lose again for a very long time, Sugar Ray Robinson. And it was a little while before they ended up fighting again.
Before they got to that 4th fight between one another, there was another interesting fight on Jake LaMotta's resume, which happened on the 21st of April 1944 against a fighter by the name of Lloyd Marshall. So Lloyd Marshall was a part of Murderers Row. Now, I don't know if anybody has ever heard of Murderers Row. Any boxing historians, of course, will have done, who were basically a set of contenders who were primarily of African-American background, who were famously avoided by a lot of fighters. So a few names on that list that people may know or may not know of to look out for. Go and check them out on Wikipedia or on Google. You've got Charlie Burley, Holman Williams, Herbert Coco Kid Lewis, Jack Chase, Eddie Booker, Aaron Wade, and Bert Leiter. They were the names on Murderers Row, and that is an interesting concept on its own, and it's something I know we would love to touch on at another point down the line. But Murderers Row then, Johnston, just put it into context for the listeners a little bit more about Murderers Row.
Well, these guys were basically, they were the most feared fighters, and during the time, obviously, segregation was still there, and black fighters just didn't get the opportunity. They just didn't get the chance to fight for world titles, and they didn't get the chance to fight the contenders either. And there's only a selective few that would actually take them on. And I mean, just jumping on, don't want to go too far, but the fact that Sugar Ray Robinson is well known to never face Charlie Burley, and Charlie Burley is still considered to be one of the best ever middleweights that ever lived, that just never got a chance. And none of these guys ever got a title shot, ever. And they were magnificent. From what you read, there are certain bits of footage on some of them. Holman Williams is another one. But obviously Charlie Burley always tends to be the guy that everybody knows. And, you know, these fellas were just unfortunate in the era they were in, because if they were around today, these guys would probably be considered to be some of the greatest fighters that ever lived. So it's a sad story, really. And it's just really, it just shows you know, at the times how dodgy and corrupt everything was, which we'll also go on to later on in Jake LaMotta's career as well.
So let's just switch it up a bit for this episode, and as we're going through the chronological timeline of Jake LaMotta, we'll stop it there around about 1944, which is what the defeat to Lloyd Marshall was, and we'll go over to Sugar Ray Robinson's career and just touch a little bit on that leading up to the 4th fight with Jake LaMotta. So obviously we've covered 3 of the 6 fights already about what happened in them and how it all went down. But for Sugar Ray Robinson, obviously, he's got an unbelievable resume himself, of course. So looking back at his career, one particular name that stands out to me, he fought in 1943, on the 27th of August 1943, was Henry Armstrong, who, again, unbelievable fighter in his own right at this time. So Henry Armstrong was 31 at the time. Sugar Ray Robinson went in the ring with him, and Sugar Ray Robinson picked up a unanimous decision over 10 rounds. Now, this actually happened after the third Jake LaMotta fight. That was one name on that record where I thought to myself, wow, another amazing name after Jake LaMotta on the resume of Sugar Ray Robinson. So Sugar Ray Robinson is 45-1 at this point in 1943 before we get into the fourth Jake LaMotta fight. But you've got to look at his career, and we know how it all ended. We know how good of a fighter he was. But then you look at his resume and you go through some of the names on his resume, and when you get names like Henry Armstrong, again, who was a fantastic, brilliant, legendary fighter in his own right, it starts to tell you a little bit of a tale of how good of a fighter Sugar Ray Robinson was and why people considered him to be the greatest pound-for-pound fighter of all time. People have him in front of Ali. A lot of people do have Ray Robinson in front of Ali. And that's why. There's reasons behind that. And when you look further into it, you see why. So at the point we get into the fourth fight with Jake LaMotta, obviously then his resume is really well built up, and he's only had that one defeat to Jake LaMotta in the second fight. So you move on and you go into the fourth fight with Jake LaMotta, and I think that's where you start to think to yourself, looking back at the resume, why did these guys end up fighting so many times? It was a little bit ridiculous, but it's like we said earlier, there's no competition for them at the time. You know, Sugar Ray Robinson's knocking out his opponents, he's outclassing his opponents, he's making them look silly. So the only guy that's really done anything in the ring with him, that's made it a life and death situation for him, was Jake LaMotta, and they certainly fought again, and they fought again in 1945, and that was the fourth fight between the two of them.
Yeah, and you saying that, I mean, the pair of them were feared. Neither of them, nobody wanted to go near them. Everybody knew that Sugar Ray was a top fighter. I mean, even going back to when he fought his 21st fight against Sammy Agnott in 41, he was actually the lightweight champion at the time, didn't put his title on the line, and he beat him. And that was the point where Sugar Ray, although he didn't have a title, he was considered to be a big business, and he actually earned himself $6,000 for that fight, and that was a big amount of money for him. I think he went and bought his mum a house, and he bought himself a car. So although he wasn't a champion, or he wasn't even, it seemed like he was going to be knocking on the door for the title, but it just wasn't to be, because people just didn't want to give him a shot. And the fact that, you know, of his colour, unfortunately, Sugar Ray Robinson, it took him longer. I mean, Jake LaMotta, it took him long. It just showed you that with just how corrupt the system was, really, before you even got to that full fight. But when you did get to the full fight, obviously at this point now Ray's 2-1 up against LaMotta, and the fourth encounter was pretty much the same as the third. There wasn't much difference. If anything, it was more convincing for Sugar Ray Robinson. And I think many observers, gave him 9 out of 10 rounds. So LaMotta, I think the one thing with LaMotta is he wasn't never a great champion, never a great middleweight champion, and he was also a big middleweight. You know, he ended up going into sort of light heavies, but he was a bit one-dimensional, and you knew what he was going to get with LaMotta. And I think one thing about Sugar Ray Robinson was he was a very clever fighter, and he just had his number. He knew how to beat him, and he knew what he needed to do, and he done that in that full fight.
I'll never forget the first time I fought Robinson. He was punching the hell out of me. And all of a sudden I saw an opening. It was in my head. Now, Sugar Ray is very superstitious. He had a horseshoe in each glove for good luck. After the fifth round, my manager kept telling me, "Don't let him hit your mouthpiece. Don't let him hit your mouthpiece." I said to him, "What the heck do I care what he does to my lawyer?" In between rounds, I could drink a brandy. I lost the decision, but I was the happiest guy in Madison Square Garden. But I got to tell you something, Rock. I fought Sugar Ray so many times, it's a wonder I don't have diabetes.
After that fourth fight, his next fight, Sugar Ray Robinson, was against Jose Pessoa, who is a mutual opponent of these two fighters, Jake LaMotta and Sugar Ray Robinson. He actually got a draw with Jose Pessoa, which was the first draw in his record. So he'd obviously won all of his fights but one, and then got that draw against Pessoa after the fourth fight with Jake LaMotta. So, you know, at this point, he's still a fantastic fighter. He's still a guy to be feared. He's still a guy who's beating everybody that's putting in front of him. But it must have been a bit of an upset in some senses that obviously this was the great Sugar Ray Robinson at that time. And there's one thing I wanted to touch on at this point before we move further on in the careers of both of them, is that you can't find a lot of this footage anywhere. You can't find footage of a lot of these fights that we're talking about. A lot of it, as you said earlier, Johnston, is down to the fact that you've got witness reports from ringside, you've got articles from journalists that were there at the time at ringside. You've got very limited information that you can source upon for this, and it's a crime that, you know, a lot of these fights weren't recorded, and a lot of it was due to the fact it was during the course of the Second World War that most of Sugar Ray Robinson's fights actually took place. And there was the story about him going on a tour as well, which was interesting, going fighting around and obviously helping support the troops as well, which was, you know, a really good story to hear about. So again, Sugar Ray Robinson, a guy that there's not a massive great deal of footage on, but the footage that is out there on him, you can see why people like Muhammad Ali was inspired by a guy like Sugar Ray Robinson.
Oh, absolutely. I think he was good friends with Joe Louis, but I think he was inducted into the United States Army the day after he fought Jake LaMotta in the third fight. So that was when Sugar Ray went in for World War II, and he was actually discharged on June 3rd, 1944, just before he fought Henry Armstrong. So, you know, during that time, he was what he did was, I believe it was some of the black army, some of the from the black guys from the army were being told they can't watch some of the exhibition fights they were putting on, him and Joe Louis, and he refused to fight unless they were there. So there was actually an inter-race situation where all the troops were sitting there watching it together, which was a first. So he had an impact. He was, end of the day, Sugar Ray Robinson and Jake LaMotta, let's get it right, they were chauvinists. They knew what they wanted. They were a bit ignorant, I suppose. But I suppose, you know, this isn't about them as a person. It's more to do with them as a fighter and what great fighters they were. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And now we're in a situation where he has now beaten LaMotta pretty much every time. And it didn't seem sort of any point to be fighting again. But it happened again for everyone down the line. But obviously there was a few things in between that before we get to that last fight that we're going to obviously discuss.
Going back to LaMotta's career then, in 1945 he actually fought another one of the fighters off the list of the Black Murderers Row, which was Bert Leiter, who we mentioned earlier. He was the second fighter from the Murderers Row that LaMotta fought April the 27th, 1945, and this time he actually got the victory in that particular fight. And then he fought Tommy Bell, and then he fought Jose Pessoa and knocked Jose Pessoa out in 9 rounds. So he goes and has one more fight before the Sugar Ray Robinson 5th fight, and for Sugar Ray Robinson at this point as well, we was talking about obviously his fights with Jose Pessoa and the draw that he got. He had 2 more fights before the 5th fight with Jake LaMotta. Now, the 5th fight between the two of them was a 12-round war. This was, I think, a bit of a pretext to what this legendary night is that we're covering, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It was a bloody battle, and both men was hurt at points of the fight, and it was a really, really close decision on the cards. It went to Ray Robinson on the night. Ray Robinson actually got the decision, and it was a split decision. Now, there was many ringside observers and journalists around at the time that felt like LaMotta actually deserved it on that night, and even Ray himself judged it to be the toughest bout of his career at that point.
Yeah, he did, and it was a bloody battle. It was a tough fight, and again, it's literally what we're reading. Fortunately, we just don't get the footage. You get some photographs, and that's about it. This one was a lot closer, and obviously LaMotta must have adapted and just tried to switch it up a little bit, and Ray Robinson maybe slightly overlooked him, maybe tried to go in with some of the exchanges at close quarters rather than fighting at distance, which is the best way to, if you're going to fight Jake LaMotta, you fight him at distance, because no matter how many times you hit the fella, he's just going to keep coming forward. So it was a cracking fight, the 5th fight, by the sounds of it. Again, it's just a shame we can't ever actually see this, and it's just people telling us another win for Sugar Ray against Jake LaMotta, and it does seem pointless, doesn't it? You're 4-1. Is there any need? Obviously, it's still a little bit of time before we get that final fight, but sounds like it was an absolute belter.
Yeah, again, just a shame we never got the opportunity to be able to watch any footage of the fight, and obviously a lot of the information that we can source, again, is from ringside articles, is from news clippings from back in that period of time. So going back to LaMotta's career then, another significant name on his career is Holman Williams. Again, this was the 3rd fighter from the Murderers Row that LaMotta fought in 1946. So 3 fighters from the Black Murderers Row, and there is actually a couple of documentaries out there and a couple of books about the Black Murderers Row, which I would highly recommend you go and watch if you are an avid boxing fan. It's certainly a good watch and a good read to really get up on your history and about how these guys were avoided, and it's quite criminal, to be honest with you, that these guys never got their own opportunities in their own right. So moving on for LaMotta's career then, I think you start to look at the back end of the 1940s now, and you've got a particular win that he had on June the 6th, 1947 at Madison Square Garden in New York. It's actually a famous scene in the film from 1980, Raging Bull. So when De Niro, played by LaMotta, is moaning about how he's got to get down to 155 pounds, Joe Pesci, who plays his brother, Joey, comes back with a great line and says, if you win, you win. If you lose, you lose. You still win. There's no way you can lose. Stop eating, you fat bastard.
It's a great scene, that, and it's a brilliant film, Raging Bull. It's one of my favourites. And Joe Pesci, that was his first real big film as well, and the chemistry between them two was just outstanding, and no doubt why they obviously went on to do Godfather 2 together, but that's obviously a completely separate thing. But yeah, I think that's pretty much the only reason why Tony Gennaro is mentioned often, because obviously Jake was, at his point, he was struggling with the weight, and I think that's one thing that Sugar Ray always said, that he always knew that LaMotta was at this point now where he was eating too much and he was probably too big for a middleweight. Still hadn't got the title shot. Neither of them had an opportunity to fight for it. It's crazy, isn't it? You just think about how legendary these two guys are. But yeah, obviously staying with Jake, he then goes on to lose after winning that fight against Tony Gennaro. He fights Phil Hudson for the infamous Billy Fox fight. And for anyone that don't know the Billy Fox fight, let's just set the scene. So Jake LaMotta is a middleweight, struggling at middleweight by the sounds of it. He's no way wants to get involved with a mob who had a huge hold on boxing at the time, especially on the East Coast. It was branching out to the West, but unfortunately he had to bend to it. His brother Joey was a guy that was sort of in and around with some of these guys, and the guys were a certain Mr. Gray, who was Frankie Carbo, and Blinky Palermo. These two guys were the underground mafia. Carbo was the murdering nutcase that used to just murder people, basically. I mean, you don't piss about with these fellas. And he kept turning them down, and then eventually he was offered this opportunity. And you see it's a famous scene in Raging Bull, and Jake LaMotta turns around and says it happened exactly that. I think it was even in his book, although he doesn't mention his brother. He just mentions, I think he's just a close friend in the book that he says. But either way, I think he meets him in the rain and he says to him, you've got to throw this fight. You know, you've got to give Billy Fox the win. Billy Fox wins, your next fight will be for a world title. So he bowed to him, and that was after, like, what was this? At the point he's 64, 11 and 3. So he's had a hell of a lot of fights and he hasn't got the opportunity. So you can completely understand why Jake would do it. This is the era. You know, so the 4th of November 1947, Madison Square Garden, he fights Billy Fox, and he basically don't do nothing. He basically stands there and lets Billy Fox beat him up. But he said he's hitting me, I ain't feeling it. And I think he throws a jab, and he said, I threw a jab, and Billy Fox looks like he wobbles. And he said he felt like he was going to have to hold him up. So he's thinking to himself, I'm throwing a jab and I'm knocking this guy out. So he just couldn't throw nothing. That's what he said. That's why he said he did it. He just didn't throw no punches. And in the end, he gets stopped. And it's the one time he really gets stopped. I think he got one other time later on in his career when he's sort of right at the end of his career. Other than that, you look at it and you see it as a TKO, but it's not. LaMotta literally throws a fight. And there was he's investigated and he's actually suspended as well.
I tried to avoid them. All my life I avoided them. My brother was the one that was involved with it. And he only did it for me. Bring back messages to me. Because they knew I didn't want to bother with them. I wanted to get an opportunity to fight for the championship of the world. I deserved it. I was uncrowned champ for 5 years. I deserved that shot. Nobody wanted to give it to me, so I just went right ahead and do what I thought was the best thing for me to do. And if I had to do it all over again, I would do the same thing.
Yeah, interesting. Again, great little story behind that. And again, if you want to read up on that, there's plenty of documentaries and articles out there to read up on that particular incident. And it would obviously come back to haunt Jake LaMotta later on down the line. So moving on then, there is so many things to consider with these two guys' careers. And this is only a whistle-stop tour of it. So I think the next significant fight for me leading up to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was eventually when he got that world title shot, Jake LaMotta. So he didn't get it in his next fight, but he did get it later on down the line. And it was not until 1949 that he actually got the fight with the current middleweight champion, who was Marcel Cerdan, who was 110-3 at the time. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant record. Again, these guys are absolute animals. So Cerdan was French. Cerdan was a hero from France. He was idolised. Now, this was the big chance for Jake LaMotta. It was a 15-round fight, and Marcel Cerdan, he got injured in the second round, and it was his shoulder that ended up getting separated in this particular fight. Now, nobody knew about this at the time. Marcel Cerdan was a fighting champion, so he would go in there and he would fight for a further 7 rounds with a separated shoulder until eventually he had to retire on his stool in round number 9. And LaMotta gets crowned the middleweight champion. So he was the NBA, the ring, and the lineal middleweight champion of the world, finally achieving his dream, which had been promised to him previously by that affiliation with Frankie Garbo and the Mob. So he finally becomes the middleweight champion of the world on June the 16th, 1949.
Cerdan was a courageous boxer. In this fight, a fall in the first round injured Cerdan's left shoulder. You will notice he can't use the arm at all. Cerdan throwing only one punch, the right. LaMotta knows it, and although he respects Cerdan, he wants that title. In round 9, LaMotta, always a great puncher, stays close, trying to minimize Cerdan's right. LaMotta in dark trunks with the white waistband sends his victory, but the gallant Frenchman won't give up, trying to get one punch home that will end it all. But LaMotta, who can give it as well as take it, steps up the pace. Cerdan still unable to use that left hand, still using one arm, his right. The end comes dramatically in the 10th round when Cerdan cannot answer the bell. His left arm, injured in the fall of the first round, proves Cerdan's undoing, and Jake LaMotta is the new middleweight champion.
It's crazy. I mean, he offered the title shot in 47. He gets it at 49, but he gets it. I mean, that's the main thing. He did get it, and he took his opportunity. And I mean, Marcel Cerdan, his record speaks for itself. 110-3. That's incredible. I mean, that is unreal. Coming away from home as well as a champion. Thought a lot of times, obviously, being French in France, so he came to Detroit to fight Jake, and he got the opportunity. And as you say, he had that separated shoulder in the second, managed to fight on. In the end, he just couldn't come out, and LaMotta wins the fight. And so, because of that, Cerdan, his initial thought, he's going to go home, I'm going to sort myself out, get myself fit again. And they actually arranged for the rematch. And I believe because he was with a famous French singer, this is why he was such a famous, I mean, not only was he a great fighter, but he was idolised in France because of the lady he was with as well. I think he was actually going somewhere to watch her sing. And unfortunately, he was in a plane crash at the age of 33. He unfortunately died very early. And LaMotta never got the chance to get the rematch with Marcel Cerdan, which would have been another cracking fight, I'm sure. So it's a shame, but these are the stories, unfortunately, that you end up picking up as you go through these careers. So yeah, it never happened. But LaMotta remained the middleweight champion of the world.
Well, it's funny because he nearly lost it leading up to the Sugar Ray Robinson 6th and final fight on our legendary night for this episode. And the one significant fight prior to fighting Sugar Ray Robinson that I wanted to touch on was the second fight they had with Laurent Defouly, which was for the ring and lineal middleweight titles, and a fight that was also voted 1950s Fight of the Year by the Ring magazine. Now, in this particular fight, Defouly was up on all scorecards going into the final round, but Jake LaMotta's pressure fighting was always there from start to finish, and it paid off in the final round as he flattened him with the left-right combination that sent the Frenchman through the ropes. It was the end of the fight. It's crazy, absolutely crazy that this guy, Jake LaMotta, who had such a turbulent career at this point and his turbulent life at this point, and this is just 1950, this is before our legendary night that we're covering, and he goes in there, nearly loses his middleweight titles that he worked so hard and affiliated himself with the Mob to do so, manages with a whisker of time left over to go and stop Defouly and retain his middleweight championships to be able to get that fight with Sugar Ray Robinson, the 6th and the final fight, which we'll talk about shortly. So that happened on September the 13th, 1950. It was in round number 15 of a scheduled 15 rounds, and the stoppage came at 2 minutes and 47 seconds of the 15th round. He had 13 seconds left on the clock when he stopped him.
Unbelievable. I mean, could you imagine today? Everybody it'd just be mayhem social media, wouldn't it? This fight, Jake LaMotta behind on all three scorecards. The scorecards were read 72, 68, 74, 66, 71, 69. It's going to be a complete shutout. And even Laurent Defouly even turned around and said that he boxed a fantastic fight for 15 rounds in 2 minutes. It's literally that last sort of half a minute, 12 or 13 seconds is left on the clock, and it is. I mean, you can actually see this. There is footage of this of Jake LaMotta. I mean, it is a pulverising finish. You can see, obviously, chasing him around the ring, and he just catches him with his left, right, and then again sends him through the ropes like he did with Robinson in their second fight. And absolutely brilliant. And then one fight that, I'm sure we probably couldn't get the whole thing of, but I'm sure somewhere someone got it out there. But what a fight that sounds like that was.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think that's one that I would have loved to have been able to fully catch up on. The full fight. Amazing, absolutely amazing. So that leads us nicely, obviously, into that fight for Jake LaMotta. But Sugar Ray Robinson's career, obviously, we'll go back to his career at the start of the decade from the 1950s, and obviously he's still in the welterweight division, and he's still defending his ring and lineal welterweight titles and getting victories. And it was at that point that he decided, obviously, a move up in weight yet again was needed, because he was beating all the competition that it was put in front of him, and he just seemed very straightforward for him at this period of time. And instead, what he decides to do at this point is go on a tour in Europe to basically get him ready for a shot at Jake LaMotta for the middleweight title. So he's moved up to middleweight, and he goes and fights in France, in Belgium, in Switzerland, in Germany, and then comes back to the USA to fight for the ring and lineal middleweight titles against Jake LaMotta.
Yeah, and that was a big thing for Sugar Ray, that he was just struggling to obviously to get any real opponents. I mean, he finally did get his title shot against Tommy Bell in their second fight in 1946 to win the welterweight title. So he did pick up a welterweight title finally after a very long time, and it was a vacant title which was actually vacated by Marty Servo. So it was a vacated title which he won, and he held on to for ages. There was a situation with Jimmy Doyle, who he died in the ring. We can go into that at another point, but basically he had a premonition in his dream, and he said he didn't want to fight. He ended up taking on Jimmy Doyle, and he actually did catch him with a left hook, and he died, unfortunately, for injuries sustained in the ring. So, as you say, he was working his way through the welterweight division with pretty much ease. A lot of these fights, it was after sort of Kid Gavilan, the second fight, which was Kid Gavilan's another excellent fighter, by the way. He literally fought most of his fights. He didn't really defend his title. Most of the time he fought at 150, 153, even as far up as 155. So he was fighting in the middleweight division pretty much all the way. And there was one fight against Charlie Fuzeri, who was for his welterweight title, but he was almost coming overweight, very slightly, but you could see he was clearly struggling to make welterweight. And then he decided to go on his European tour, embark on his European tour, and he was brilliant. And he came back from the European tour ready to rock and roll. He prepared himself to fight Jake LaMotta to pick up the middleweight title.
This is where it gets interesting then. Obviously, the build-up to this particular fight, there's one particular story from the build-up to this fight that, when I read through the details of it, it made me laugh, because it just made me think, at the time, what benefit did Sugar Ray have from doing this? So when they actually met to sign contracts for the fight for the middleweight title, Sugar Ray Robinson actually tried to psych out Jake LaMotta, and he did that by drinking a glass of blood which was drained from a beef steak. This is Jake LaMotta, by the way. No fucks given with this guy, and Sugar Ray Robinson tries to psych him out by drinking a glass of blood from a beef steak, which I thought was a pretty funny story, but a strange story at the same time. But for LaMotta, it didn't even faze him whatsoever, because obviously he was just as aggressive on fight night as he was any other time. But the one thing that was interesting for this particular fight for Jake LaMotta was that he actually struggled to make the weight for what was his third defence against Sugar Ray Robinson. He actually was 6 pounds over the limit the day before the fight.
Wow. See that was always a problem with him. I think he just liked his food, but he was very close. I mean, he was you could see the footage, and you could also, from we've read and loads of historians and observers said how much of great shape he was in. I mean, he must have had to starve himself as well to really get himself down to that weight. And I think Sugar Ray knew that as well. And I think he's 4-1 up basically going into this 6th fight, and that drinking the blood is just class, isn't it? I mean, apparently he used to do it for stamina. I suppose there's a lot of iron in it. I don't really know. I mean, it worked for him, I suppose. So he's trying to psych out Jake LaMotta. No chance. Sugar Ray playing mind games, and obviously he knew he was struggling at welterweight. He knew now he's now going to go in and fight at middleweight. Pretty much been fighting at middleweight since sort of Kid Gavilan fight. Had the one defence. He was still the current welterweight champion as well, by the way, but he always openly said that if he wins this fight, he will fight at middle. I think there was never going to be any intention of him going back down to welterweight. So from this point, and pretty much this is where you start really seeing the footage of most of his fights as well. Ironically, not really so much at welterweight, where he's considered to be one of the greatest. So it's literally hearsay where we can see how good Robinson was in a way at middleweight. But just touching on their relationship, I mean, obviously they knew each other very well. This was an opportunity for Jake to get a bit of revenge. I think he was ready for this fight, and Sugar Ray wanted to prove that he was the better fighter, and he was going to be the man to take over that middleweight crown and look to cement his legacy as a middleweight as much as he did as a welter, which people actually, a lot of people turn around and say that at this point he was up there with Henry Armstrong as one of the greatest lightweights ever. So he was already considered to be a great welterweight, not lightweight, welterweight, and the middleweight was a new horizon, a new thought for him, and a new process for him to really cement his legacy as an absolute icon.
Leading his handlers up the stairs, the middleweight champion LaMotta dethroned the stout-hearted French Moroccan Marcel Sedan in 1949 and has since successfully defended his title in 3 engagements. The bell rings. Jake stops whatever he's doing. Consequently, the exact amount of time is spent on each phase of training. His beautiful blonde wife is a familiar sight wherever LaMotta trains. Endurance and stamina have always been in LaMotta's favor. But the wear and tear of the ring has taken their toll, and Jake faces a severe test against Sugar Ray. Robinson and LaMotta have fought 5 times, with Sugar Ray emerging victorious on 4 occasions. 5 years have elapsed since their last meeting. LaMotta, since acquiring the middleweight title, has become a very cautious fighter. But come February 14, caution will be thrown to the wind as the champions meet his severest test, the dazzling and hard-punching Ray Robinson.
The fight itself, then, let's just touch on a few facts about the fight itself. So it happened 14th of February, and it was in 1951, and it was at the Chicago Stadium with an attendance of 14,802 people, and it was a big money fight. This was actually a big money fight back then, because the gross gate for it was $180,619, and the net gate turned out to be $138,938. Now, this doesn't seem like a lot of money in 2020, but this was 1951, so you can probably times that by about 10, and you're probably looking at about anything between 50 and 100 million, I think, for this particular fight. That's what it probably equates to in our money. So it was a ridiculous amount of money, because even though Sugar Ray Robinson was 4-1 up at this point, Jake LaMotta was the middleweight champion of the world. Sugar Ray Robinson had obviously moved up from the welterweight division to challenge him. He did his tour of Europe, and he came here. At the time the fight happened, Sugar Ray Robinson was 29 years old. He was the 3-1 favourite for this particular fight as well, whereas Jake LaMotta was 28 years old. Now, in terms of the purses for this particular fight, so Jake LaMotta took 45% of the net, which he received $62,522 plus $1,500 from the television rights as well. Sugar Ray Robinson only got 15%, which was $20,840 plus he also got $1,500 from the television. And that just, to me, goes back to the fact that at this moment in time, as we pointed out on a number of occasions, boxing was controlled by the Mafia at this point. And you're probably wondering to yourself, why did Sugar Ray Robinson never get involved with them? Well, Sugar Ray Robinson was actually well established on his own, and one of the biggest things about the mob and boxing was that they targeted fighters who weren't necessarily going to get themselves onto a platform without their assistance. So when the one and only time they did approach Sugar Ray Robinson, which was Mr. Gray, Frankie Carbo, about doing business, Sugar Ray Robinson weren't interested in doing it, and that was it. There was no repercussions from the mob. There was no stronghold over him. It was just a case of he was already a well-established fighter at this point, because he obviously won welterweight titles and he was this big name and he was well known and he was quite flashy and quite fancy and driving around in his Cadillac, and obviously did all the stuff that he did during the Second World War as well to help the troops. So he was already a celebrity himself really at this time, whereas for Jake LaMotta, he wasn't as much of a celebrity. He was a guy that he just wasn't going to make the cut, really. People didn't think he would ever win a world title. So obviously when he did eventually win a world title, it was a big surprise to many. And obviously as years would go by, there'd be a lot of more talk of obviously boxing and the Mafia involved. But it made me think about these purses. It made me think that was probably, looking back on that and what we know about the history of boxing and the Mafia's stronghold over it, it was probably likely that Jake LaMotta got more of the purse than what Sugar Ray Robinson did, not only because he was the champion, the defending champion, but because of the fact that obviously the boxing was controlled by the Mafia at this point. Without knowing fully the details, it was probably likely that the Mafia had a lot of influence over the gate recipients for this particular fight. Even though Sugar Ray Robinson was involved and he didn't necessarily do business with them, they obviously had more of a stronghold over what LaMotta was doing in his career because of their previous affiliation. So it's crazy to look at the fact that the purses were so disproportionate here. And for me, it just goes to show you that boxing and the Mafia at that period of time just went hand in hand, and it just goes to show you how much of an influence they had at that period of time. So going back to Jake LaMotta, this was the third defence of his middleweight title, and at this point he had a record of 78 wins, 14 losses and 3 draws on his record before getting into the ring for the sixth and final fight with Sugar Ray Robinson.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the fact that the title was it was the NBA, was it, at the time? I think that was the title, wasn't it? And Jake was the champion, and they run it. They run their organisation. That was basically it. Anything that was happening in the East Coast was all Mafia led. Especially in Chicago. Obviously, Madison Square Garden was there. That was their patch. You couldn't get a fight there without their go-ahead. And as you say, with Sugar Ray Robinson, after the Civic fights, which happened sort of 1942, that was the time when Sugar Ray Robinson actually became his own manager. He got rid of Carl Harmon and actually got old Mike Jacobs, another name we know, Mike Jacobs, who was a part of the old Joe Lewis, Max Schmeling fight, and Mike Jacobs was also a part of, I'm not quite sure his affiliation with it. I think he managed it and I think he had to deal with them, unfortunately. I don't know the ins and outs of Mike completely, but he actually took $10,000, Sugar Ray Robinson, from Mike Jacobs to buy out Carl Harmon, who was his manager at the time. So he obviously sees himself. He was a very astute businessman when it comes to his fighting and negotiating fights, although this one in particular probably doesn't look so great. But I suppose if you're going to be dealing with these guys, he obviously see it as I'm going to win this title, and no matter what, I'm going to bring home the bacon so you can give me what you want, and I'm going to earn a shitload of money after, and that's exactly what happened. So the fight itself, great fight, and a great start from Jake LaMotta.
So this was one of the first big fights that was actually put on what is now known as our goggle box, the TV. So the popular technology of a home television was brought into a lot of people's households at this point in time. So it was one of them big major fights that was on the TV. So this was a big transcending moment really for boxing, and obviously what a fight for them to actually be able to get their eyes on really, which was this one. So Jake LaMotta started this fight the way he started pretty much all of the fights, which was to go in there and target Sugar Ray Robinson's head and then try to work the body. Now I think Jake LaMotta knew at this point, judging by the fact that we know that he was overweight the night before, that he probably wasn't going to be able to have the stamina to go the distance in this fight. So it was obviously all about him trying to get Sugar Ray Robinson out there. And that's exactly what he was trying to do in the opening rounds. He was trying to get Sugar Ray Robinson out of there, and you can see the tenacity he's got in him. It just seems to be that little bit more edgier than the previous 5 fights, where there's more urgency to the work that he's putting in the first few rounds. And obviously because of that weight issue, you wouldn't have known it at the time as a fan watching it. You would have just thought look at Jake LaMotta, look at him go for it. He's trying to stop Ray Robinson here, and he was trying to do that. But obviously, Sugar Ray Robinson is a beautiful boxer, absolutely beautiful boxer, and his aggression was so calculated. He was using a lot of energy sapping shots to Jake LaMotta's midsection. So whether they knew something about the fact that he was obviously overweight, massively overweight, that they wanted to use that to his advantage, and they targeted the body because they knew that's where they were going to sap his energy from, and that is exactly what he did in the first few rounds.
He did. He fought on the back foot, Sugar Ray. He fought really well on the back foot and was just popping off that jab. Although one thing in that opening round, for instance, with Jake, I thought his left jab was brilliant. I thought he was working well behind it, and when he was getting close, he was really having a go at Ray, and I think he did go for broke in that first round, and he did really go for it. Obviously, as you say, his mindset is just try and get rid of him early. And it was pretty much the battle of the jabs for pretty much the first sort of 3 rounds. And although I felt that Sugar Ray, sort of in the second and the third round, I thought what he started to do was he was able to keep Jake at bay, tie him up at times, and he was actually starting to get off that right hand behind that jab, and they were effective, and they were really hard, solid jabs when he really sat down on them, and it sort of stopped Jake in his movement going forward, but he would still keep coming forward. So he stopped him in his tracks a little bit, but not so much. But that third round for me, I thought was an excellent round, and it was literally where Ray he has a great little, literally from the beginning, he's going to the head, he's going to the body, and he's tying him up when he's in close. Jake sort of continued to stalk him, but yet Ray was sort of circling around him, just popping off that jab, and it was great to see. This is 1951, for goodness sake, and just watching Sugar Ray Robinson was almost just like he's so ahead of his time. It was ridiculous. Landing those wonderful combinations to the head and the body, throwing a stunning uppercut at one point in the third or the fourth. It was just a bit clever, and he was trying to make you could see Jake really forcing the issue, but unfortunately you could see he needed to get rid of him earlier, and you could see Robinson had a plan. He had a long plan, and it was going to be, I'm going to just work my way through these rounds, tire him out, and then I can do my business later on. And yeah, it was. But in the fourth round, sort of Jake came back into it. I thought he fought really well. I think it was a good round for Jake in that fourth round. But so I did sort of 2 apiece going into the fifth.
I think the biggest opportunity for Jake LaMotta in this fight, I think it came in the 6th round for me. When you look at the 6th round, he really hurt Sugar Ray Robinson with the left hook, and it was followed up by a vicious combination that actually drew blood, and it had Sugar Ray Robinson in a little bit of trouble at this point as well. And bearing in mind, obviously, in that second fight, he'd put Sugar Ray Robinson through the ropes and won that fight. So he obviously seen this as his opportunity, but Sugar Ray, he had the knowledge, and as you said, he had IQ way ahead of his time. He was able to survive that onslaught and carry on throughout the rounds, and that was his plan. It was to basically draw the energy away from Jake LaMotta and the aggressiveness of him, and he knew what to expect because they'd been in there so many times, they'd shared the ring so many times. Even though this particular fight was 4 or 5 years after their last fight, they'd still shared the ring that many times, and it was probably like riding a bike for the pair of them, really, getting in the ring together once more. But for Sugar Ray Robinson, he would continue to battle on throughout the fight, and as it got to the later end of the fight, he's looking at about round 11 now. This is where you can see, watching back on the fight, LaMotta's gas tank is pretty much empty now at this point. He's unloaded shots left, right and centre. Sugar Ray Robinson's elusiveness and his counter-punching was absolutely sublime. And you can see that the champion at this point is staging what is probably his last-ditch attempt to really rally against Sugar Ray Robinson. He's trying to drive him into the ropes. He's unleashing like these barrage of punches in what is probably his final effort to try and force a stoppage against Sugar Ray Robinson. But these types of gambles in a fight like that were never going to pay off, because by the end of round number 11, Sugar Ray Robinson's got him reeling, because Sugar Ray Robinson's counterattack again was brilliant, and you can see where the likes of Muhammad Ali and even Sugar Ray Leonard used that same blueprint in some of their major fights in their career, where They would basically leave short bursts in, say, the last minute to 30 seconds of a fight, and then they would throw these punches where the challenger or the champion or whoever it was they were fighting at the time would spend all that energy out, that they just basically got a lot of hurtful punches off by using the counter-attack. And this is what was happening in the latter end of the fight with these two, with LaMotta and Robinson, is by the end of the 11th, Jake LaMotta's absolutely spent. He's getting hurt at this point, and you're going into the 12th, and I think, for me, the 12th round was where it marked the end of what was previously a competitive fight.
It was. I mean, it was close, wasn't it? It was close up to about round 7, and then thereafter, LaMotta was out of gas. You know, there was no, you can't make no bones about it. And Sugar Ray, it was a tactic he had already adopted before this fight even started. It was 100% what his game plan was. And you could see him sort of going through the gears from the first round, literally, how he just ups the tempo. He would double up the jab, and then he would throw the right hand. And then the next round, he'll throw the right hand, and then come with the left, and then throw an uppercut. And then he'd back off. And although Jake's having his moments in some of the rounds, he's sort of giving him odd rounds here and there. It was pretty close, but it was just beautiful at times from Sugar Ray. It really was. And, you know, one thing I will always look at when I watch this fight in particular. I've watched it before and watched it back the other night. It was almost like watching a mirror image of Muhammad Ali, and obviously this happens before a certain Muhammad Ali come along. So you can clearly see how much of an influence this guy had on Muhammad Ali, because he fought pretty much the same as a sort of a heavyweight, obviously, but it's just uncanny, really, and but just to see how great he was in this era is just outstanding, and Ray just continued to just sort of, as you say, going into the 11th round, it was actually it was quite brutal. I mean, I think today that fight would have been stopped. You could see Jake now, his hands are just so low, and he's literally defending with his chin, and that's about all you can say, really. While Sugar Ray Robinson is just unloaded on him, and vicious shots. Big right hands that obviously doesn't go down, and obviously you see the famous thing from Ranging Bull where he's sort of saying, "You never got me off my feet, Ray. You never put me down, Ray." I mean, that is an absolute just made up myth. If you ever watch the fight, right, Jake LaMotta ain't in no condition to be talking to Sugar Ray after the fight. The reason why they call it the St. Valentine's Massacre is literally because he gets pulverised in that 11th and 12th round.
He certainly does, and Sugar Ray Robinson's obviously out to do what no man had ever done before, which was to put Jake LaMotta on the canvas. In 95 fights, he'd never tasted the canvas. And it was strange because, like you said, the referee refrained from stepping in the fight. The champion somehow managed to survive through them rounds, and even the ringside physician would visit the corner of Jake LaMotta between the rounds, but still allowed the fight to go on, which was, again, quite strange. But this was Jake LaMotta. This was a guy that would never go down, as you know, you would rightly point out there. And like you said, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the reason it's called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre is because in round number 13, LaMotta, he absorbed a truly horrific pounding. Now, everybody ringside and everybody watching this fight could see that he was done. The fight was done, essentially. The champion had no chance of winning, but he simply refused to go down, and he withstood seemingly an endless amount of Robinson's best punches, and it just seemed like the referee was reluctant to stop it. And he's, you know, even as LaMotta, he can't even keep his hands up at this point. He's just literally on the ropes getting pummeled. Absolutely pummeled. He's staggering about. He's being caught clean. Vicious shots that probably would have knocked out many other fighters on the planet. But this, again, is Jake LaMotta. And it was only after a really flush right hand that nearly took his head off completely that they decided it was finally time to stop the fight.
2 minutes to go, round 13. LaMotta at this moment, a tired battler, a chopping block. Robinson trying to KO him. For 8 rounds, LaMotta gave better than he took. And then Robinson unleashed all of his best guns for the last 4 rounds. These are clean, whistling shots, lefts and rights. How he can survive them, nobody knows. Head shake at the ringside. The fight is going to be stopped on the signal from the chairman of the Illinois Athletic Commission, Joe Kleiner, to Frankie Sikora. The fight was stopped in the 13th round with our scorecard
showing that Ray Robinson was ahead 63 points to 57. And in the 13th round, the hard luck round, the championship of the world has changed hands. And there you see it, a champion gone down to defeat. The fight was stopped on a signal from Joe Trine. Here's the announcement.
Ladies and gentlemen, the winner by a technical knockout in 2 minutes and 4 seconds of the 13th round, and the new world's middleweight boxing champion, Sugar Ray Robinson.
Ray, I'm very pleased to welcome the new middleweight champion.
Thank you. It's a very hard fight. I'm very glad to win. I'd like to say hello to my good friend down in Miami, WW. Everything was okay. I'm not hurt, and I'm sorry that I could not get a chance to turn over the check for $25,000 to the Runyon Fund here for the Chicago. I forget the
Chicago University. I have the check right down.
Chicago University.
I mentioned that you hadn't the chance to put it.
It's for $25,000, and ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to know, I'm happy to say that I am a member of the Runyon Fund that donated that check. We also sent $25,000 to California, $10,000 to Howard University, and this $25,000 that we donated tonight to the Chicago University is well over $200,000 that we've contributed to such worthy causes, and we hope to be able to raise much more and help other charities. WW, I done the best I could.
I'd like to ask you one question before you go, Ray. When did you know that you had him? Because you were fighting pretty evenly for 8 rounds.
Well, that's the way we planned the fight. We figured LaMotta would be strong as he was first part of the fight, and the last part of the fight he would weaken. We figured to box along the first part of the fight and wait till he showed signs of weakening, which he did.
I see.
And in those late rounds, after the 8th, he showed signs, and my manager told me to start open up heavier punches.
Now, it was actually the ringside officials who signalled the end to the fight. And the referee then jumped into the ringside officials, basically signalled to the referee that this fight needs to stop now. This fight needs to stop, and that's exactly what happened. He stopped the fight. The referee steps in and he raised Sugar Ray Robinson's hand, and he becomes the first fighter to essentially get a TKO victory over Jake LaMotta. But Jake LaMotta never went down in that fight, and that is what brings that famous scene in the Raging Bull film, and that is also why it's known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, because of how much of a pounding he took in that fight. There's no way in this day and age that would happen. After 3 or 4 punches, it would have been done. There must have been what, 20 to 30 unanswered punches, probably more. Ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. But that would call an end to the fight, and that would be the end, and that would be the end of their saga, and the end of what was a legendary tale between these two. Unbelievable.
It really was, and it was like a fucking zombie, wasn't it, Jake LaMotta? When you watch that and just seeing him stand there, just getting pounded, literally pounded, as you say, unanswered shots, and it was just, just watching it back, you sort of just think, God, blimey, like what on earth is the referee? It's sort of. He goes to jump in and he goes, no, I think he's going to come back. no, so hesitant. It's not even funny. And at times you sort of hope that Jake LaMotta. I mean, it describes him as a person in general, not just this one fight alone. How he just doesn't go down. It was just that's his true grit and determination. And people talk about chins. I mean, how about your legs, man? I mean, he's still standing there. All right, he's leaned up against it, but his legs ain't even buckling. And if you ever watch Sugar Ray Robinson and when he's nailing people with those right hands, how many people, as you say, does he put away? It's ridiculous. And you're talking tough fellas, and just shows you just how solid Jake LaMotta was as a fighter. But my God, it's just an absolute beating, and should have been stopped a lot earlier. I think it should have been probably stopped the round before, if not the round before that. But it was the time, and it doesn't make for a St. Valentine's Massacre if it didn't go on a bit longer. So, we've got the opportunity to discuss it and watch it back. So that's brilliant. What a tremendous fight. And what a great character from Jake LaMotta.
Oh, it certainly was. It's that fight, after the fight had actually happened, he was actually attended to in his corner after being helped to his corner for 20 minutes before he could even walk back to the dressing room. Now that, in today's age, would be, again, it's an absolute no-no, basically. That guy could have had brain damage. That guy could have essentially died from injuries sustained in the ring at that point, because they didn't have that technology to just basically send him to get scanned for a potential bleed on the brain. He's just goes to show how much of a granite guy that, and it also goes to show how much pride can get in the way of a fighter sometimes, that he absolutely refused to go down. He was never ever the same after this, never the same again. He retired 3 years later. He never fought for a world title after this. This was his last world title fight, where he defended his title for the third time and lost it, and 3 years later he retired. He was just never the same again. But I did find a funny little quote from him actually, in his later life, where he basically said, "If the referee had held up another 30 more seconds, Sugar Ray would have collapsed from hitting me."
That's his defence. That's brilliant.
So he was an
absolute
legend all the way till the end. Jake LaMotta, absolute legend, completely. So the aftermath for this particular fight then, really, for Jake LaMotta, as we was talking about just then, he never fought for a world title again. He then went on to retire 3 years later after having 106 fights, winning 83, losing 19 and drawing 4. And he retired on April the 14th, 1954, after his final fight against Pilligal Core. Now, for Sugar Ray Robinson, it was a different story, really. A little bit of a sad story, to be honest with you, because obviously that would be a massive night for him, winning that title. He would continue to go on and win and defend the middleweight title and lose it and have great fights with guys like Gene Fulmer and Carmen Basilio. And obviously you look at his career and you look at the aftermath of his career and what it meant for boxing, but he ended up going on to fight until 1965, which he was way past his best at this point. Going into that final fight in 1965 with Joey Archie, he'd had 173 wins, 19 losses, and 6 draws on his record at that time, with a total amount of fights of 202. So with 202 fights, his boxing record stands at 202 fights, 175 wins, 108 wins by knockout, 19 losses, 6 draws, and 2 no contests on his records. Unbelievable record, that. But the reason he fought for so long was because he ended up, some of the stories that we've spoke about on previous episodes, like Joe Louis, for example, he ended up poor in his later life. He ended up having no money because he just couldn't help but spend that money, and he ended up owing money out in taxes. And it's all the same and similar stories from that particular era of time, where they ended up going on having to fight longer than what they should have done to kind of keep themselves sustained, because they owed money to the IRS in America, to the tax office, basically, and they ended up having to go on to fight for longer. So for Jake LaMotta, there was an interesting documentary that's out there called Boxing and the Mafia, and in that particular documentary there's a scene of Jake LaMotta actually having to go to court to testify about his involvement in the fixing of the Billy Fox fight when Frankie Carbo was arrested and put on trial. And Jake LaMotta absolutely had no qualms about sitting there and saying, yeah, I was told to fix that fight, and he did. And for whatever reason, they never touched him, they never did anything to him, they never threatened him, they never did anything of the sort to his family. They just left him be. That guy just had no remorse, and there was just literally no fucks given from him. That was the way he was. He could have been living in fear for the rest of his life, but he never did. So, yeah, interesting documentary to go and check out, which does have a little bit on this particular fight, which is Boxing and the Mafia. Documentary, it's probably got a good 15-20 years old, but it's definitely worth going checking out. But this is a brilliant legendary night. This is one where it really takes you back to a completely different age and era of boxing, when we didn't have all the social media around, the internet, everything like that was around. It was just two guys that were the best at what they did, and they went in there and they fought 6 times, and this final one was such a brutal and bloody affair that it was nicknamed the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Yeah, and going back to Jake, I mean, the fact they fought 6 times, there's another famous quote he comes out with is that, I fought sugar so many times that no wonder I didn't get diabetes. I thought that's another cracking line from Jake LaMotta. And he's quite a character. I mean, he lived into his 90s as well. I mean, that's just... I mean, the guy's got balls of steel. You know, not only does he's just the granite chin. That's one thing. You know, if you think of Jake LaMotta, you think of the granite chin. You think of just pure will and desire. And as you say, no fights given. The fact that he sat in court and said, didn't personally named Frankie Carbo, but he said, yes, I took money to fix this fight from the Mafia, and that, you know, it just shows you they could have quite easily got rid of Mr. LaMotta with shot of heroin like they did with Sonny Liston. After the fight, he fought a light heavyweight as well. That's the other thing. I mean, if one thing I noticed, he fights Bob Murphy, Norman Hayes, and Gene Harrison, and then literally fights the three of them again, but beats them. And that's basically that's about as good as it got for Jake after Sugar Ray. And then after that, as you say, he had his last 4 fights, 2 wins and 2 losses, and pretty poor end. Unfortunately, the thing is with Jake is he just didn't get the opportunity earlier in his career. If he had got the opportunity earlier and he had held a title when he was at his peak, I think he would have been considered more of a great middleweight champion rather than, although he's considered a great middleweight, just not a champion. Just didn't get the opportunities. And then obviously with Sugar Ray Robinson, as you say, it was a sad end for Sugar Ray. And I mean, the one thing no doubt there's just running through his career after it. I mean, the Randy Turpin fights when he comes over to London on his second European tour, because he needed some challenges, and he travels to Europe and loses to our very own Randy Turpin. And in the rematch, I'm sure we could probably do a legendary night on that one, Sean, no doubt. And then like fighting guys like Rocky Graziano is that what an absolute legend he was. Gene Fullmer, Carmen Basilio. I mean, the list goes on. And it's probably after that. I think after that Gene Foreman fight where he won that title, the middleweight title again, he should have called it a day, probably around 1959. But as you say, he did carry on. He just went on and on and on, fighting for peanuts, just to pay the tax man. Poor old Walker Smith Jr., as he was his original name, retired in 65. But what a legend for me. I mean, Sugar Ray Robinson will always be my favourite fighter of all time. I know we don't have the footage at welterweight. We only have what's sort of given to us, what we read. But looking at him as a middleweight, in the footage that you do get, I think he's absolute just ahead of his time. I think he's iconic in the way he fought. And, you could put him in today's world and he would still beat people. And he'd beat the best, because that's what makes you great, I think. He's there with your Carl Lewis's about athletics and your Maradonas or Pele's in football. This guy is an absolute genius, one that I'll never get tired of watching.
So this was the tale of Sugar Ray Robinson versus Jake LaMotta, the 6th and final fight, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. We hope that you've enjoyed us breaking down a little bit of their careers and this particular fight. If you have, please go and let us know on social media, on Twitter at Legend Night Pod, or on the Facebook page for BTR Boxing Podcast. If you've not already subscribed to the Legendary Nights podcast, you can do so by checking it out on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify, Castbox, wherever you get your podcasts, we're there. Go and find us, Legendary Nights, go and subscribe to it and get all the latest episodes of the Legendary Nights series. And we hope you've enjoyed this particular tale of Sugar Ray Robinson versus Jake LaMotta.
And right now, Thomas Hearns is an open book for Ray Leonard. Backs up against the ropes.
This is one of the most unusual calls by a referee in the history of the sport.